sense of hope in difficult times, and not say, let's pretend everything is okay for one day and then tomorrow we'll go back to being depressed. No, it's always a mix of light and dark, peace and violence, hope and despair. And that's where the gospel comes to life in the real world.
What if you turn hardship into greatness, anger into serenity? Everything changes. Make your life a masterpiece.
Welcome, I'm Yannick, your host, and now join me, Françis X. Françis X is the Parkman Professor of Divinity at Parkman University. And welcome, I'm Yannick, your host, and now join me, Professor Frank Clooney, to discuss Christmas. Welcome, Frank Clooney from Boston, Massachusetts. The show is such a treat to have you finally back.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be back and happy to be on the show, especially at this time of the year. It's very nice to join you again after some time.
Christmas is also a story of contrast, dark and light. Explain.
Well, I think the insight that we need to have, if we're thinking not of the 2,000-year tradition of piety and illustrations and local customs, which is very complicated, and that's all wonderful. But if we think of what we learned from the New Testament itself about the birth of Jesus, about the details of his, how it came about Mary and Joseph and so on, we should realize two things. One is that several of the Gospels tell us nothing about this early period. So the Gospel, according to Mark, simply begins with John the Baptist coming out of the desert. And nothing is said about the birth of Jesus, Mary, or any of that. And that's the first of the four Gospels. So that we have to remember. And then John, the last of the four Gospels, has a grand prologue with this glorious, grand imagery of, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and then finally the descent of the light into the darkness. But no details about Bethlehem, about Mary, about any of those stories. So remembering that not all the earliest authors of the Gospels thought that this was necessary to tell. So we have the two accounts. We have the stories by Luke and Matthew, which are often considered to be more or less contemporary. So a few decades after the death and resurrection of Jesus, we have these two Gospels, and both of them chose to fill in the background and talk about how it is that who Jesus was, who his family was, his relationship to the great traditions of Abraham and David and so on like that. And they give us details that really fill in the story. I can go into detail, but the last thing I'd say, just as an introductory remark, is that for most of popular piety, the two are woven together as if they're one story. And so if you see the typical Christmas crib, the creche scene in a church, or even on a Christmas card, an illustration of some sort, you'll often see Mary and Joseph and the baby in the stable. You'll see the animals around. You'll see the Magi, the wise people who come from the East, and all of them in one scene, and as if it's all one story. And to some extent it is, but at another level, we have to remember that Luke mentions Bethlehem, the shepherds, the angels who sing in the heavens, and says nothing about the Magi. And Matthew says nothing about the stable or the angels or the shepherds, and tells us about the Magi. So there are two kind of parallel stories, that I think most of the time there's no problem in putting together. But on another level, it's actually instructive to take them and see them as separate stories. And you could say, as you were alluding at the beginning, one of them is sort of light and the other one is dark. The two sides of the reality of the world into which Jesus came, a story of hope, light, promise, and a story that has tinges of violence all through it. If you'd like, I can go into details, but it's up to you.
Very good. So how does these two accounts differ from one another? And then explain us why is that?
Well, I think let me do it this way. I can I don't want to go on for a very long time, but I can give you first of all a simple account of what Luke tells us, and then I can tell you something about what Matthew tells us, and then we can think about them together, and then why it is that they're two, why is it that they're different, and so on. So Luke's gospel, which is very beautiful and perhaps the favorite gospel for so many people, particularly this time of the year, opens with the scene of the message to Zechariah, who will be the father of John the Baptist, that he, although he is older and though his wife Elizabeth is older, that they're going to have a child. This is a very dramatic scene. Zechariah goes in to incense the Holy of Holies as a chosen priest for that time, and an angel appears to him from God. It turns out to be Gabriel, one of the archangels, and tells him, "You shall, your wife shall conceive in her old age." Old age, probably just beyond childbearing. It doesn't mean a very old lady or something like that. And that there'll be a child, and he shall be a great one, and he shall prepare the way of the Lord. And there are details that we needn't go into about how Zechariah is somewhat skeptical and is struck dumb. He can't speak until the baby is born. And those are dramatic details. But it's a positive story that this time has come, and John the Baptist is the one who will come first. And then it turns out that Mary is the cousin of Elizabeth. And so these two families of Zechariah and Elizabeth, Mary and Joseph, are related to one another because Mary and Elizabeth are cousins. And then having had the story where Gabriel comes to Zechariah and dramatically proclaims that there'll be a child, then the angel, and famously in the scene most Christians call the Annunciation, comes to Mary in the village where she lives. And a similar story about Mary, do not be afraid. Mary, do not be shocked, but you're going to bear a child who will be the Son of God, the Great One. And Mary, like Zechariah, is amazed at this message and quite puzzled by it. And yet there seems to be a sense that, well, he was skeptical and doubting. Mary was simply asking, explain this to me in terms I can understand. And the angel Gabriel tells Mary, the Spirit shall come upon you. The child you conceive in your womb will be filled with the power of God. And so it's a very positive scene. And then at the end of the scene, to bring the stories together, Gabriel says, as a sign of what God will do for you, I tell you that your cousin Elizabeth, who many people consider too old to bear a child, she is in fact pregnant. And she is 6 months into her pregnancy. Her child is coming soon. And so this amazes Mary, who says, be it done unto me according to your word. And it says immediately after the angel left her, she travels, probably walking for a day or something like that, up into the hills to where Elizabeth is, to be with Elizabeth in the last months of her pregnancy, to help her, prepare the way, maybe be even the midwife or whatever. So that's all very beautiful. And then the next chapter, we hear the story about how when the time came for Mary to give birth to her baby, then it's the time when the Roman Empire, the emperor has commanded that there be a census, and everyone has to go back to their village, their ancestral village. And Mary and Joseph have to go to Bethlehem because Joseph is descended from the family of David, the royal family. And so they go there, traveling again. Usually it says on a donkey. We have no reference in Luke to a donkey. They just go there. And there is no room for them in the inn. So it's crowded. People have come back. And famously, they end up in the stable. And they put, the manger, their animals around, their shepherds in the field. And the child is born in this improbable setting. The illusion is that he's descended from the great King David, but the humble surroundings, being in a stable, no room in the inn, the child is born there, and then there are angels singing in the heavens. And the angels speak to the shepherds and say, go and see this remarkable thing that had happened in the stable there outside Bethlehem. And the shepherds go running there. And I think it's deliberately in Luke's sense of how the work of God is for the poor, for the simple people, not for the pretentious, educated people and so on, but that the poor people, the shepherds, will be the first ones to see the birth of the child and be there to see. And they go and they rejoice exceedingly when they see what is not remarkable. They simply see a young woman who is born a child and her young husband and the baby in the manger where the animals usually do their feeding. And they praise God and they go home rejoicing because all the things that God had told them have come true. And that's really, for Luke, the end of the story. After that, after a certain number of days, they bring the baby to the temple to present him to the Lord, as Mary has to be presented also, the mother. They go there, they meet Simeon and Anna, these two old people who have been waiting in the temple for years, it seems, for the Messiah to come. And they immediately recognize that out of all the people in the temple, there's no halos around the heads of Mary and Joseph and the baby. But they say, this is the couple we've been looking for. This is the baby. Simeon breaks into song and praises the baby. Anna apparently does the same, but we don't have her words. And it's all kind of wonderful. There's a hint and a promise that eventually there will be suffering in the lives of Mary and the child. But nothing more is said about that. And then Mary and Joseph and the baby go back to Nazareth. And it says that the baby grew up, grew in wisdom and size and strength and health there in Nazareth. And that pretty much is the end of the story. It ends with that happy account. So if we take that, it's sort of the promises are made. The angel Gabriel comes down and speaks to the father of John the Baptist, to Mary, the mother of Jesus. It unrolls. It's a beautiful scene. And all that happens is good news. Now, that in place, if we then turn to Matthew's gospel, we see it's a different tone. And perhaps Matthew, deliberately says, I won't retell the story that Luke has told if Luke came first. We don't know really which one came first. But Matthew begins with a long genealogy, all the way back to the beginning, to Adam, talking about who begat whom, begat whom, begat whom, who were the people who were there, who brought forth children along the way, all the way to King David, all the way then down to the child in Bethlehem. And the point seems to be to say that, first of all, kind of officially, even though in Matthew as well as in Luke, Joseph is not really the father of the baby who is conceived by the Holy Spirit, that he will be, because of his father's identity, born into the family of David. So the son of David, future king, will be the spiritual king as David was the material king. All of that sounds good. But then it begins to come apart in a different way. The genealogy is a text with all these unusual names. Most of them we've never heard of. We don't hear of again after this story, and some of them are not even mentioned in the Hebrew Bible. But nonetheless, the lineage is given. And it's interesting that there are, I believe, 5 women referred to in the genealogy. So the genealogy is basically father, son, father, son, father, son, father, son. But it seems that at certain points in the genealogy, women are mentioned. And the scholars, and I'm not the Bible scholar, but note that it's interesting which women are mentioned. And I'll just give you the names very briefly because it's actually relevant. So the first one mentioned goes back to the book of Genesis, Tamar. And Tamar is an interesting woman because she is twice a widow. Both her husbands have died. And then after being twice widowed, she somehow realizes that's her duty to bear a child by Judah. was one of the really patriarchs of the Jewish people at this point, one of the family of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and their children. And Judah's a major figure. And it has to be done kind of by trickery, that she has to kind of, there's a little bit of subterfuge involved. I won't go into the details right now, but that finally she does have intercourse with Judah and bears twins to him. So that's a bit unusual. Rahab is another woman mentioned in the story from, I think, in the book of Joshua. And she is helpful to the Jewish people because she helps them when they're spying on their neighbors and also trying to help them to escape when they're being pursued and so on, the men who are the spies. But she's a prostitute. She has a house of ill repute, as people used to say. And she becomes the mother of Boaz, who is one of the lineage leading up to King David. So you have Tamar, who's twice widowed, then by subterfuge ends up bearing twins by Judah. Then you have Rahab, who's a prostitute, who ends up being the mother of Boaz. And then Ruth becomes the wife of Boaz and the mother of Jesse, who is the father of David. And Ruth is not a Jew at all. She's a Moabite. It's a very beautiful story, the little book of Ruth, how she was sent to work, kind of like a worker for the Jewish family. And then when she's released from the work and told she can go back home, she has a lovely relationship with the woman she's working for and says, I will stay here. You are now my family. And it works out. There's no other real problem, except that the grandmother of King David, the quintessential Jewish king, is not even Jewish. And that's an interesting thing to point out. And then after David is mentioned, and David will be the father of Solomon, but the mother of Solomon, the wife of David, is Bathsheba. And Bathsheba, as we know, and it's a kind of one of the sadder stories of David, is the wife of Uriah. And Uriah is a good man. He's a loyal follower of David. And David sees Bathsheba bathing from the roof of his palace. He can see her bathing on the roof of her house and decides he wants her for his wife. And by a complicated arrangement, it turns out that he arranges that Uriah will be killed in battle. He's kind of put out there in front, and then he's not protected and killed. So then David marries Bathsheba and has a child, Solomon. So that's problematic too. Finally, the fifth woman mentioned is Mary. And the way Mary is introduced is not by annunciation, not by a message of an angel, but by Joseph noticing that although they are engaged to be married but not yet living together, Mary is pregnant. And Mary, if the story, let's say, is parallel, Mary has said nothing to Joseph about being pregnant by the Holy Spirit, and Joseph is wondering, what about this? I'm going to marry this young woman, and she already is with child. Who's the father? And so he decides, being a good man, that he will not shame her in public, but that he will break off the engagement and send her back to her parents, and that'll be the end of it. They can worry about what to do with the child and so on like that. But instead, Joseph has one of the 4 dreams that he has in the first chapters of Matthew, in which the angel says to him, basically annunciation to Joseph, do not be afraid, do not be upset. This child is by the Holy Spirit. And therefore you can take Mary into your house. There is no other man. There is no scandal. But the very fact that this doesn't even come up in Matthew, the whole beautiful story of Mary, Joseph, and the baby could have ended before the baby is born. Go back to your parents. Well, I'll have nothing to do with it. Ends up not being the case, and the baby is born of Mary and Joseph only because the angel spoke to him. And then he has, Matthew has, after having gone through all of that in the first chapter, then a very offhand comment, after the baby was born, the Magi come. And no angels, no shepherds, no stable, no manger, no glorious scene in the night, but almost like an afterthought. Okay, Mary's pregnant. Guess what? 9 months later, the baby is born. No cousin Elizabeth, no mention of John the Baptist. And the Magi come, and this is one of the beautiful scenes in the Gospels, that it shows up in so many pictures of Christmas. That the wise, we say men, but they're not really indicated to be men. They could be women or men, or both women and men. And it doesn't say there are three. It just says the Magi. People think there are three because they bring gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. So they figure each one of them had a gift, but nothing is said about three. They come from the east, having read the stars as astrologers, and they see a star that indicates there will be a king born in Israel. And they come. And again, we like to jump to the point usually. They come and they find the baby in the manger, and they worship and they give their gifts, and it's all very beautiful. But because they can't quite locate where the baby is, they go to King Herod. And this is, of course, part of the story, but it's often shifted off. Their going to King Herod is actually a rather painful scene, because Herod is terrified when they say to him, the new king of Israel is going to be born in Bethlehem. And he says, oh, wait a minute, I'm the king. We don't need another king. And therefore, he's wondering what to do. His advisors look up prophecies from the Hebrew Bible, and they realize, yes, a child shall be born in Bethlehem. And so Herod decides, hypocritically, he says to them, I would like to come and worship the baby too. So once you have worshiped this baby, come back and tell me exactly where the baby is, and I will come and worship. Of course, he means he will kill the baby. That's all he wants to do. So they go, and they they go and they find the baby, they worship the baby. They are there. And once they are there, an angel appears to them in a dream and says, get out of town. Don't go back to Herod, because Herod is trying to kill the baby. And they take off and they escape into the desert by another route. And then Herod, realizing that they didn't obey him, what does he do? He says, well, I'll be safe and I'll kill all boys under 2 years of age in Bethlehem. Slaughter them all just to make sure I get the right one. And so he sends his soldiers. Meanwhile, an angel appears to Joseph again and says to Joseph, you also get out of town. Herod is coming. And so apparently in the middle of the night, Joseph gathers up Mary and the newborn baby. They escape into the desert, and it says they go to Egypt. There's a prophecy indicating Egypt. Do they actually travel to modern-day Egypt, pyramids and all that? It's not clear, but they go far away, out of the territory of Israel. And then Herod sends in his soldiers, and they slaughter every boy under 2 years of age, kills them all. And it seems to me, if we step back and think about this, we don't see this as part of the Christmas story. All the lovely scenes with the Magi there, the camels, the gold, frankincense, and myrrh. There's no Herod soldier in the corner with a sword. And yet Matthew is stressing not the beautiful details, but the dark details. The uncertain genealogy, these women who improbably end up part of the lineage of Jesus, the doubts of Joseph, who was the father of this child. The Magi coming actually causes many boys to be killed. And at the end of it, Joseph and Mary and the baby are refugees. They're migrants. They end up being homeless. They have to run away. And that's sort of where it ends for Matthew. It says only later, an angel comes to Joseph in a dream again, a year later or 5 years later, 7 years later, and tells them, Herod is dead, you can come home. And so they come home and they end up in Nazareth. And that's the happy, unhappy version of the story, according to Matthew. So we have these two versions next to each other. Luke's, which is all kind of light and beautiful, message to the poor, and Matthew, which is all these kind of dark, improbable, embarrassing events, ending with this violence and slaughter of the young boys. And these are the two Christmas stories. And I think it's very interesting that, again, Mark and John have no Christmas story. But Matthew and Luke have such different stories side by side. And while we can piously and popularly combine them at a Christmas crib or in Christmas carols, nonetheless, if you look at them separately, you realize it's kind of a dark story of the troubled world and the violence in the world, and a story in Luke of good news for the poor, good news for the outcast, all will be well. And I think maybe these are two sides of Christmas. Christ is born into a world where all will be well. Christ is born into a world where all there is darkness and violence and bloodshed and refugees. And I think realistically, we live in a world where there is hope and where there is violence. So I think it's actually powerful to realize there are two stories next to each other.
Yeah, where there is light, there is also darkness, and it's so accurately actually depicted, you know, the human existence and the importance of this story that really sheds light into the darkness that we actually are born into. Now, how does these two accounts shape the theological understanding of the Nativity?
I think I would say in two ways. I mean, one way is that many a theologian through the past 2,000 years, and so it's a vast generalization, theologians, Catholic and Protestant, of the Orthodox churches in the East and so on, focus on the fact of incarnation. You know, that God is received into the world, the child is born, God on earth will all be leading to salvation, to resurrection, but first death and the cross. And that's the main thing. How is it that God became human in this child, Jesus, who is God and human at the same time? But I think what scripture scholars have pointed out over the past, couple of centuries, saying, well, don't just theologize this in terms of the meaning of incarnation, but rather look at the details. And I think they appreciate, as you have to do with all the chapters of Matthew and all the chapters of Luke, that these are two venerable stories from 2 or 3 decades after the birth of death of Jesus, in which you have two people who are probably not original followers of Jesus, even though there's a Matthew mentioned in the gospel, the tax collector. This is probably not the same Matthew, at least scholars think that. But the two of them tell the story, and they have their own ways of telling it, their own ways of explaining the meaning of Jesus, not contradictory, but looking at it in two very different ways. And I think, in a sense, you can say that nowadays, theologically, it's not enough to talk about incarnation, Son of God, Mary, the Mother of God, but rather talking about what did it mean that God became human in which world? What is the world like in the year, when Jesus was born, when Jesus grew up, when the Romans were ruling, when you had evil kings like Herod? What was it all about? And what was the hope for the people, hope for the poor? And sort of seeing these as two stories that are side by side. So the theology of Christmas through Luke's eyes heads in one direction, the theology of the birth of Jesus through Matthew heads in another direction. And I think nowadays, the best scripture scholars and best theologians would look at these as different accounts. Some will say they're simply different, period. And others will say that they're not incompatible. It's just that they're talking about different aspects. You could say there's no contradiction between the two stories. However, it's one like somebody who tends to be more optimistic and hopeful will tell a certain story in a certain way. The other one, who's more pessimistic, cynical, will tell the story in another way. And in a sense, Matthew and Luke, they have personalities and they tell the story in two ways. And I think today, therefore, the theologian would be saying, we learn from both of these stories about the reality of the world into which Jesus was born. A world of rich and poor, insiders and outcasts, a world of power, people who control things, people who are threatened by anything new, and people like Joseph, Mary, and Jesus who stick with it and somehow survive the violence. And then, the story of Jesus develops from there. So two theologically interesting stories that are complementary, but they're not the same story.
So interesting that you actually mentioned that, because everything we do is always a value judgment, right? And so it all depends on what you value. And based on that, it's you see just different things in different situations. And therefore, these different accounts are just a more accurate depiction of reality of probably the same event, but just from different perspectives. So brilliantly said. I truly, truly found it so
Yeah.
profound what you.
Yeah, I think you can see this. If we think about again the piety and popular piety of the Christmas season, and both religious people and secular people and priests preaching from the pulpit, pastors preaching, and the music on the radio and so on like that, stresses that was a beautiful time. And when Jesus was born, it was kind of a perfect world. Everything was lovely. And so too in 2024, we should pray for peace because he's the King of Peace. That can be hopeful, and it is hopeful for people who are in trouble and people who live in difficult situations to realize he is the King of Peace. He has come for the poor. He will be with us in our lives. But also, it can be comforting to say, well, the story was never 100% positive. It wasn't like when Jesus was born, the world was entirely at peace. You had, good emperor in Rome being benevolent and kind, good kings in Israel. Everybody was nice. No, these were wicked people that, the Romans had no business being in Israel at all. They were conquerors. They were ripping off the country like they did other countries. They didn't belong there. Herod was propped up. He was a dictator propped up by the Romans. He didn't belong there. And to somehow tell people, even if you look at the news and you see how difficult the world is and how difficult it is for anybody to imagine, peace in this world or hope or light in the darkness. Nonetheless, in the beginning, when Jesus was born, it was a world that was really tragic and violent, and innocent children being killed and people being driven into exile, like Mary and Joseph. Therefore, the world in which we live, the very uncertain world of 2024, is in many ways like the world into which Jesus was born. There is hope. There are good people. There is a possibility of light in the darkness. Good will overcome evil, but the evil is real. It's not just metaphorical. It's, evil people who slaughter children, rich people who don't share what they have with the poor, very ambivalent, mixed, confused families. So if the family of, the ancestors of Joseph have all these kind of, skeletons in the closet, as people used to say, this birth was unusual. This one, she wasn't even Jewish. This one, she was a prostitute. This one, Bathsheba got to be the wife of David only because he had her husband killed in battle. These are all embarrassments. And we could say, well, the Holy Family was perfect and it was always perfect, whereas my family is not perfect. Matthew is showing us that the lineage, the family into which Jesus is born, was a very imperfect, improbable family where all kinds of things were always going wrong. And that we can look at it and say, well, my family wasn't perfect. Or, how about my ancestors? Who knows what they did? Not to worry. Even in human families that are really human, God is working. And the fact that people, do the wrong thing, or people who are supposed to be marginal do the right thing, that will happen in our time too. We shouldn't judge and say, oh, that woman's been married twice before, or, that woman's a prostitute. That woman's not even like us. She's not even Jewish. No, say whoever is in the family, whoever is among us can be a messenger from God. And that to have the hope that even in my family, even if not everyone is perfect, who's perfect, there is still hope, because the realism is God comes to us in the families we have. God comes to us as we are in the world in which we find ourselves.
Give us a little bit of taste of your life as a person who has devoted his life to Jesus Christ as a Jesuit, but also at the same time as one of the most distinguished professors in the world. So give us a taste of what the structure does to you in your life, being embedded in the Catholic Church, and why you think it's so important for basically everyone. It doesn't mean that you have to become a priest. It's important that you have the certain social structures that help you, again, as you pointed out, to look at the life, positive, that there is a way forward in order to live a meaningful life.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I think we're all in a position, if we have faith, to witness to the faith, to be examples of faith, to talk about our faith to people who are open to listening to us, among our friends or family and outside. But I'm in a position that is more, accentuated because on the one hand, I'm a professor. I teach in a university, and that means I'm often dealing with students who are struggling with their lives. And they may be thinking, my life is a mess, my family's a mess, look at the horrible things going on. And other people have perfect families, perfect traditions, and they have everything. To say, well, that, is not the case, that the world has always been messed up. And just because you are struggling as a teenager or college student or grad student and see the world in trouble, don't despair, because the message that we have at Christmas is that God does good things in bad situations. The other aspect, of course, is that as a priest, I preach. And so all these Sundays of Advent talking about the readings, the coming of Christ, John the Baptist, on Sunday before Christmas, the Sunday before Christmas, the visitation, the story where Mary goes and meets Elizabeth. And Elizabeth is 6 months pregnant and Mary's just pregnant. And you have two women talking to each other about the incarnation and about the meaning of God coming into the world before men talk about it at all. And so I have to explain those things. And then on Christmas, again, not sort of just an optimistic scene saying, in the beginning, everything was perfect, like a holiday movie or something like that. And then don't worry, everything will be perfect again in 2025. No, to point out that things have always been in trouble. Things have always been difficult. And that if you have your eyes open, you see the world is in trouble. You personally may have health problems. You may be depressed. You may be a widow or widower. You may have worries about your aging parents or about your children who are experimenting with life. To say this, from the pulpit to people in the church and say, we have right in the beginning, in the stories we have in Luke and Matthew, stories that help us to be realistic about the world in which we live and hopeful even in difficult situations, and not to say, this is really not for me because I'm not perfect, my family's not perfect, the world is not perfect, let's skip Christmas this year. But no, because we are as we are, it's precisely God comes to us. And I think that if you take Matthew and Luke as a pair, both speaking to the church in 2024 at Christmas, they're really saying to you and me, and then I think to the people I'll preach to in church on Christmas, Eve, Mass, and so on, that all of this is part of God's plan. God came because the world is beautiful. God came because the world is in trouble. And if our world is beautiful and there are beautiful people, and if the world is in trouble and there are evil people, God comes again. And so it's really meant, for students in school and for people in the parish and, other people we meet, and even doing broadcasts like this, talking about this for a wider audience, is to understand that, the realism of the world and the pessimism of the world is not new. It's always been a troubled world. And into that same troubled world, God comes. Jesus comes into the world as it is, not as we wish it would be. And therefore, to try to give people a sense of hope in difficult times. and not say, let's pretend everything is okay for one day and then tomorrow we'll go back to being depressed. No, it's always a mix of light and dark, peace and violence, hope and despair. And that's where the gospel comes to life in the real world.
Beautiful. I can't more agree. Is there a similar story that in Hinduism, for example, that shows similar this Christian understanding of the nativity? Does it somehow resonate with Hinduism? And if so, can you elaborate on that?
Well, I think so. And I think it would, I could give you an example from Hinduism because I've been, for 50 years plus now, studying Hinduism from when I first went to India after college a long time ago now. But I think you could, tell the same story in terms of Jewish history since the first century. You could tell it in terms of the Quran, the teachings of the Prophet, Islamic history, Buddhist history, religions of China, religions of any part of the world, Africa, Native Americans, and so on. This mixing of light and dark, the good and the bad, as creating a real world. All of that could be told. But Hinduism that I know about, I think, again, there's a possibility of romanticizing the stories, that you have great figures like Rama and Krishna, or gods like Shiva, or goddesses like Kali. And you have all these figures, and they can be seen as like statues. And they're, Krishna is perfect, Rama is perfect, Kali is a mother figure, and everything is lovely. But if you read the stories, it so to speak makes your hair stand on end. The violence in these stories, the tragedy, the sense that the god or goddess comes into the world to fight evil as harshly as necessary to defeat evil. Some of the same dynamics of the good and the bad mixed together. One of the examples I can just point to in the stories of Krishna, not so much Krishna of the Bhagavad Gita, which is a certain kind of teaching, but there are other stories of the birth of Krishna, Krishna born into a palace, Krishna growing up in a village, which are quite beautiful stories that are very old, and they appear in ancient texts, the Vishnu Purana, the Bhagavata Purana, and other versions. And there are pictures of them, paintings of them, and so on. And one way to take it is that, isn't it beautiful that Krishna was born into a royal family and then grew up in a lovely village where his mother and the women in the village were all very lovely and they loved him, and the children were nice, and the cowherds, the men and women, were very nice people. And it was like absolutely bucolic. It was like paradise on earth. That is in a sense true because the world was enlightened and filled with grace and beauty because Krishna came into it. But the same stories highlight the fact that it was trouble from the beginning. So not unlike, in fact, very similar to the story of Herod, there is the evil king who appears in the early stories of Krishna as a child, Kamsa. And King Kamsa is threatened by the fact that there is this child come into the world who will be the one who will restore righteousness and defeat evil. And Kamsa knows, hey, I'm evil. That doesn't mean good for me. And therefore wants to kill the child. And so it's a bloody story, but as the mother of Krishna, Devaki, as she starts bearing children, one by one, not Herod, but Kamsa takes the children and kills them because he has her kind of, is watching closely her and her husband. And whenever a child is born, Kamsa has the child killed. And finally, there has to be this intrigue by which babies are switched, and the baby Krishna, when he's born, is kind of smuggled out of the palace before Kamsa can kill the child, and taken off to a village to be raised there. And that very scene is again like the Magi and Herod wanting to kill the baby and killing other babies and so on like that. So there's that story, and then Krishna is in this lovely village where everything is perfect except when it's not perfect. Partly there are the dangers and tragedies of life. One story is that he is threatened with death because a demoness comes in the guise of a wet nurse and wants to breastfeed the baby, but actually has poison on her breast and will kill the baby. And she may or may not have been sent by evil King Kamsa, but in fact, because he's God on earth, Krishna ends up killing her and is protected from the poison. But the fact that, the little baby there and the mother's there and this beautiful woman comes in and the baby's about to be killed, or the baby, the little boy Krishna goes off to swim in the pond, maybe to bathe and swim in the pond, and there's a big snake living in the pond, which kills children. And the snake grabs onto Krishna, the little boy, to kill him. And Krishna, again, being kind of a super boy, in a way that we don't really see with Jesus, he ends up killing the snake and is saved, and the other children are protected from this dangerous animal pond, and so on. There are other stories like that, and increasingly at various points, Kamsa finds out where the child is and keeps sending these, hitmen to kill the child. And one by one, Krishna kills them. But the danger is there, that it's not a bucolic world, it's not a paradise, because there's danger lurking around every corner. People are in disguise. People, somebody's like a wet nurse. Somebody else is just a tree, but the tree is actually a demon. Or the lake is beautiful, but there's a snake in the lake. All these dangers have to be dealt with until finally, later in the book, as the boy has grown up, he has to have a battle with the evil King Kamsa and kill him. And I think, again, it's it's not the same as the story of the birth of Jesus. It's not the same as Matthew and Luke, but the idea that the beautiful coming of Krishna into the world in the palace turns into a story of bloodshed and the evil king, the smuggling of the baby off to the village, and then all these kind of dangers in the village, which probably reflected dangers in village life, that so many infant mortality rates were very high in ancient times. So many babies died, and Krishna, in a sense, was vulnerable either to all just simply the health dangers, or was, it was presented mythologically in terms of demons coming and so on. But he survived it all. But the point is that even the most beautiful village where Krishna is living was actually a dangerous place. And I think that's a parallel. And one could point to stories of, in the Buddha, the childhood of the Buddha growing up and his father trying to protect him from all danger and all suffering, and then failing because the boy realizes people do get sick, people do get old, people do die. And he says he radically changes his way of life and refuses to become a king. So I think, and the Prophet Muhammad, you can, stories about the beautiful messages that come to him, but then he has enemies, and there's wars to be fought even in his own lifetime. It's very dangerous what's going on. I'm not the historian to get into the details, but nonetheless, all these great figures seem to have a mix of light and darkness, safety and danger, love and hatred around them. And that if that was the case for all these great figures and for Jesus, then that gives us, again, hope that in our dark, dangerous world, uncertain in so many ways, there will be hope even among us. And that's what religions teach us.
And that's what you truly give us really hope. So last question, Frank, what makes you particularly hopeful this Christmas season?
Want to be hopeful for this Christmas season? I think, I would say in two ways. One hope would be there's so many places in the world troubled with violence, and I'm not going to go into details, where the innocent, which is most people, are suffering, and where destruction of towns and villages and countries invaded by other countries and terrible famines and civil wars being fought. I would hope that somehow people could find a way to end violence justly, So not simply, peace just, so that the bullies win, but rather peace in which there's justice also. So that would be the prayer for the world, that all these terrible things we see, that there might be some coming of peace, that by next year's Christmas, 2025, there will be more peace on earth than there is in Christmas 2024. We could go on with a list of praying, for the environment, for restoration of nature. All these things concern us. And then in our own country, I certainly won't get into political commentary. It's not my field. But to say that there seems to be so much, bitterness and suspicion and demonization among American people. Not only do I disagree with you, but that you're evil, you're wicked, and I have nothing to do with you. Disagreements are fine. Politics are always involving compromises. I think we always like some politicians and don't like others, but some sense of kind of putting back together some common human values, that we are sisters and brothers in this together, and that in some way, despite our differences, we have to be able to respect one another and not demonize one another. That would be my hope, in the United States.
Beautifully said. I think that we should really start first and foremost looking at what we have in common with our people that we disagree, and then from there we can actually build. Beautiful, Frank. Thank you so much for being back again to the show, and for everyone who is listening. This was the Parkman Professor of Divinity at Harvard University. What a blessing, Frank, you are really to me and really to the world.
Thank you, Yannick, and thank you for offering me this opportunity and for talking about these issues for a wider audience. And keep up your good work, because what you're doing, knowledge does matter, and having these dialogues matters in terms of giving us more hope that we can talk to one another, whatever the circumstances. Thank you, and blessings for Christmas, blessings for the new year.
Merry Christmas to everyone. Françis X. Clooney.
That's why knowledge matters. Make your life a masterpiece. Visit now programs.d-ykm.com. Meant to make you grow.